Jordan Peterson destroys Q&A. That's the clickbait title of his appearance on the show, which is only half true. In reality, the show destroyed itself years ago. Clickbait notwithstanding, this was the panel that one would expect of the flagship program of far-left propaganda centre, Their ABC. The panel consisted of a weak Liberal MP Alex Hawkes, condescending feminist ALP MP Terry Butler, angry cat lady Van Badham, transgender author who played cricket against the girls Catherine McGregor.
Excuse me, it's ma'am. It is ma'am.
And of course, Jordan Peterson, whose first exchange with condescending feminist Terry Butler went like this.
I do stand by my original statement, though, that there's a brand of more radical feminism that insists that our culture is best characterized as an oppressive patriarchy, and I think that, first of all, that's an appalling sociological doctrine, and I think it has very negative psychological effects. And they won't be limited to men, because if it's true that there's something toxic, let's say, about masculinity per se, what that will inevitably mean is that as women adopt more masculine roles, traditionally, what is that toxicity somehow going to go away?
But that's a straw man, because no one says there's anything toxic about masculinity per se.
What do you mean no one says that? The term exists.
This was the first, but certainly not the last instance of gaslighting by the condescending feminist. She spent the entire show pushing the usual feminazi rubbish of toxic masculinity is traditional gender roles and whatnot. Meanwhile, Jordan finished his response and discredited her entire feminazi agenda before it had even begun.
How is that a straw man? Well, where did the term come from?
It's a phrase that's used about forms of masculinity that are harmful to men and women. It's not about masculinity per se. You must know that.
I read the American Psychological Association guidelines for the treatment of boys and men, and I know perfectly well that this is no straw man. And it's not only devoted towards what you might describe as the more aggressive ends of masculine behavior. It's aimed at masculinity in a much broader range of. There's a much broader range of accusations that are under the surface than that.
Then Milo Yiannopoulos turned up and asked a question about Peterson not standing up for people that Peterson answered with an apology for past wrongs. He handled this quite well, and it was a bit of a non-event, but worth noting. We soon saw radical feminism in action when a young man asked a question about fathers not gaining access to their children and the high rate of suicide among men. He got an applause for his question, then Snowcone Jones went straight to Van Badham, who promptly sighed and rolled her eyes because real men's issues of life and death don't matter to plump cat lady feminazis.
The fundamental truth we need to grasp here is that men are not oppressed because they're men. Men will be oppressed in their lives for all kinds of different reasons. They might be oppressed because they're working class. They might be oppressed because of their ethnicity or their religion or their age or their sexuality or their ability status. But at no point in human history have all men been judged, oppressed, disenfranchised, kicked out of institutions on behalf of their maleness. That just has not happened.
This is a rubbish answer. Society expects only men to fight and die in war, and had she listened to the question, men are literally losing custody of children the vast majority of the time simply because they are men, not to mention our record male suicide rates. Men are far more likely to be homeless and to die violently. Women get affirmative action, men don't. We are literally living in a society that oppresses men simply because we are men, as I will explain further shortly. Women being excluded from things like politics isn't oppression, it's just common sense. Giving women the vote is literally oppressing men, again, as I will explain shortly. At any rate, she just rambled on boring feminazi talking points, as you will now be subject to.
And I think where a lot of feminists get really frustrated is that we are constantly subject to these crazy, literally straw man arguments about you believe in this and you hate all men and it's you feminists who are undermining everything. And yet, where is our control of institutions?
You get the point. It's meaningless communist rubbish. feminists do have a chokehold on the institutions while constantly claiming they don't because patriarchy or whatever. She doesn't answer a valid question about very serious issues and instead craps on with debunked feminist rubbish. All she does is prove that feminists do not care about real world issues. They only care about pushing their agenda. One fact she conveniently ignores, like all communists, aside from the high rate of suicide and other real issues that we're asked about, is that when you look at genders overall, only men pay net tax. Giving women the vote, who are the majority of society, means women have access to the violence of the state. Evidence shows that overall, they use it to coerce the resources of men without the need to offer any real value in return. This without generally having to participate in war or other physical conflict. She flat out lies when she says feminists don't have institutional power. The state we live in is literally a feminist dictatorship designed to drain men dry. Halfway through the show, a chubby feminist audience member pretended to ask Jordan Peterson a question, but went on a rant about far-left things like climate change and other nonsense. Jordan gave her a good little shutdown.
All this much about individual responsibility. Most of us are never going to be able to afford to have all of these assets to have responsibility over. So what is your advice beyond banal comments like clean your room?
Well, you know, it's actually rather difficult to answer a question that ends with your comments are banal, politely. So, you know, I would consider that more of an opinionated personal and political statement than actually a question. So why don't you try reformulating that so that there's an actual question there?
Peterson answers the question by telling people they have more control than they think. But the truth came from Catherine McGregor.
When I was young, after I left the military, I went through a very belated youthful rebellion and flirted with the Communist Party of Australia. I didn't join, thankfully, which would have made my subsequent life in the Labor Party more difficult. But I was inducted into a cell in Canberra by people who were smoking their own body weight in marijuana. And there's a reason they call it dope, not smart. Fair dinkum, you know. These guys were saying, you know, your military training will be invaluable. And the alarm bells started to go off because I didn't see myself as the pointy end of the revolution. But when you can't make the rent and you can't keep the power on, you make a pretty poor revolutionary.
Towards the end, we got the highlight of the show.
I only learned today that you're a Christian.
I am.
I'm
Christian, I'm very devout.
Christian and a Marxist.
Yes, both at the same time. In the great Western tradition of being able to hold two positions at once.
Actually, I think the tradition she's thinking of is this one.
How many fingers, please?
4. What else can I say? 5, 4. Anything you like. Only please stop it. Stop the pain.
Hi everyone, I'm Van Badham, and I'm just a normal Christian Satanist. All hail the Dark Lord and his arch nemesis Jesus Christ. Tomorrow I'm going to start losing weight on the eat as much junk food as you want diet. Then I'm going to a rugby game because I just really love Australian rules football. The final question came from an American man asking the panel what they would do if he pulled out a MAGA hat and put it on, referencing the fact that he'd been assaulted by leftists for doing just that. To which condescending feminists said, "Yeah, but we are talking here, aren't we? Good. Why does right-wingers always talk about censorships? I've never been censored, meh." And Badham responded by hilariously claiming conservatives were just moaning at getting a little bit of criticism, apparently for the first time ever. This is because she's clueless and not living in reality, which explains why she's a communist. Then she said this.
If you were wearing a Trump hat in my company, I would leave. I'm not interested in Trump hat beliefs or Trump hatism.
To which Liberal MP Alex Hawkes later said,
Cap, and I have no problem with Van leaving, but in America...
Unfortunately, he backed down and said he didn't mean it because he's a Liberal MP and thus he's a coward. Watching this episode reminded me as to why I never watched Q&A, or the ABC for that matter. It was two hardcore feminists, centre-left Jordan Peterson, a weak-kneed Liberal politician, and a transgender author.
It is ma'am!
It was a boring and contrived discussion with two radical feminists pushing their nonsense on the flagship political show of taxpayer-funded ABC, while simultaneously claiming feminism isn't the establishment. Catherine Rodriguez's answers weren't as overtly incorrect as the two feminazis, but were so boring she could have put ice heads to sleep. This is where the ABC is sitting right now. They are clueless, and while Peterson was relatively interesting, he barely got to speak. He took his allotted 1 minute per answer, while the others went well over their time. But this highlights the limits of old-style TV, and why online discussions are far superior. By the end, you could see he was bored and frustrated. Check out the tweet Q&A moderators put up too. Jesus was a left-wing Marxist.
You are so dumb. You are really dumb. For real.
Yes, and it's totally possible to lick your own ears. I suggest the idiot who tweeted that should try. The most fun about this show was trolling in the live chat. There were plenty of people that wouldn't normally watch this leftist trash, and lots of fun and banter went on there. This kind of format just plain sucks. The interesting speakers aren't given enough time to generate good content, and while some questions were decent, there were too many that weren't thought out and were designed only to attack panel members, especially Peterson. There is a reason TV is dying, and this show is a perfect example of this process. Why would they invite a literal radical Marxist in Van Badham if the show isn't ideologically bent to the left? Where is the equivalent of her on the right? Why don't they invite well-spoken ethnic nationalists? If Jordan Peterson is the opposition to this rubbish, then you know you have a problem with left-wing bias. It's boring and the content sucks. Aside from Peterson, the panelists were second-rate with nothing of value to add, and Peterson didn't even add much new content anyway. He beat any of the panelists or questioners challenging him, but that's not really saying all that much. On the bright side, at least it was a reminder as to why it's best to get content on the internet and to ignore the old-fashioned, lying, dying mainstream media. I hope you enjoyed the video, share the truth around, and I'll see ya when I see ya.
Mother, take it outside. If you want to call me sir again, I will show you a sir.
I apologize.
Mother.
I apologize now.